What if the oldest ancestor in your blood stepped off a single ship 400 years ago? And what if, right next to you now, there are tens of millions of people who carry that same person in their blood too? In November of 1620, 102 people came ashore from a storm-battered ship on a frozen coast they should never have reached in the first place. By the first spring, only 53 were still alive. The rest were buried in soil they had barely had time to name. 53 survivors on the edge of an entire continent. And what those 53 did next is almost impossible to grasp. Today, by estimate, 35 million living Americans are direct descendants of that one half-dead voyage. More than 1 in 10 people in the entire country. And there are 3 questions worth sitting with. How does a handful of people who left 4 centuries ago end up written into the DNA of tens of millions of strangers? Why these few in particular, when thousands of other colonists sailed in, lived out their lives, and vanished without leaving a single genetic trace? And the last one, which is personal to you. If even one branch of your family goes back to colonial New England, what are the odds that one of them is in your blood right now? And could you even prove it by spitting into a tube tomorrow? The answer starts with a man who lost his wife before he ever set foot on land, and whose hand wrote the only lines that let us know any of this happened at all. William Bradford was orphaned in Yorkshire, fell in with a persecuted congregation as a teenager, fled with them to Holland, and at 30 boarded the Mayflower. The ship was still at anchor off Cape Cod when his wife Dorothy fell overboard and drowned in the icy harbor water. No one made it to shore. He became governor for 30 years and wrote the chronicle by hand that we would otherwise know nothing about. And here is the thing to keep in mind for the whole video. There were only 53 survivors. That was the entire gene pool from which everything that followed grew. When a new population is launched by a handful of people, each person's genes begin at a share that would be unthinkable in a large country. What was rare in England shows up far more often here. That is the founder effect, and it is what turns 53 names into 35 million. Among Bradford's descendants, records name Clint Eastwood and Noah Webster. But the fertility of different lines would not be the same, and the next one would leave more descendants than anyone else on the ship, even though he was not a believer at all. John Alden was hired in Southampton as a cooper for a single voyage. But the colony asked him to stay, and he stayed for Priscilla Mullins, whose first winter took her father, mother, and brother all at once. They had 10 children, and according to applications to the Mayflower Society, their line left the most descendants of any passenger. This is the first answer to why these people. In a tiny gene pool, fate is decided not just by who survives, but by how many children they leave behind. A line with 10 children fills family trees for thousands of families, while a line with 2 nearly disappears. Differences in fertility are what make some founders everywhere and others invisible. Among the couple's descendants are Marilyn Monroe, Dick Van Dyke, and Orson Welles. 10 children is arithmetic. The next man survived against all arithmetic. John Howland was 21 when a storm hit in the middle of the Atlantic, and passengers were told to stay below deck. Howland came up. The deck gave way under his feet, and he was swept into the black, icy water. And a man overboard in the Atlantic in 1620 was dead. But he caught a hanging line and held on until they hauled him back with boat hooks. He survived, married Elizabeth Tilley, who had been orphaned that same winter, and they had 10 children, a line whose descendants' genealogy names as including 3 presidents. And here a thread begins that we will return to at the end. One very rare inheritance will travel in this family strictly through the female line, from mother to daughter. Remember that detail. And the genome of the next survivor made it through just one child. William Mullins was a prosperous shoemaker from Dorking. We know this because the inventory of his estate survived word for word. 126 pairs of shoes and 13 pairs of boots, enough to outfit an entire settlement. The first winter killed him, his wife, and his son. Only one daughter survived, 18-year-old Priscilla, the same one who married Alden. This is a pure bottleneck, Almost all of Mullins's genes passed through the eye of a needle through a single heir. If she had not survived, the family name and the genes would have vanished into that frozen ground as well. Instead, Mullins's inheritance spread through one of the broadest lines in America, even though the surname itself disappeared within the first generation. His genes were saved by the miracle of one teenager, and the survival of the whole colony depended on a man who came to kill. Miles Standish was a hired soldier who had fought in the Netherlands. He was taken on as an outsider, with no share in the faith, for one reason only. He knew how to fight. His wife Rose died the first winter. He stayed and kept the colony alive against hunger and threats, and the founder effect only works if the founders live long enough to have children. Stephen Hopkins, meanwhile, was the only person on board who had already crossed the Atlantic. In 1609, he survived a wreck near Bermuda that is thought to have inspired Shakespeare's The Tempest, and he returned again. His son was born right on the voyage and was named Oceanus, after the ocean beneath the keel. But experience does not guarantee a clean line. The next family was a disaster for the colony, and still seated a future president. John Billington caused trouble from the first day. His son nearly blew up the ship by firing near an open barrel of gunpowder. And in 1630, John himself shot a neighbor and was hanged, the first execution for murder in the colony's history. And that is the paradox that explains half of history. In a large population, that family would have disappeared without a trace. But in a population of 50-odd people, there is almost nothing to filter out. Survival is random, and everyone who lived long enough entered the gene pool, including the darkest family. The same logic makes isolated groups vulnerable to rare diseases. One carrier among a handful of founders, and that gene variant spreads through all the descendants, as with the Amish, where entire communities carry mutations from one distant ancestor. The son of the executed man opened the lake that later supplied the colony with water, and President James Garfield is counted among his descendants. And the next marriage connected two founder lines into one for the first time. Susanna White gave birth to a son right on the ship, before they even landed. Peregrine White became the first European child born to these people in New England, survived the deadly winter, and lived to 83. His father died that same winter, and the widowed Susanna married the widower Edward Winslow, the first wedding in the colony's history. From this marriage comes the collapse of family trees. In a closed community, people quickly marry descendants of the same founders, and after a few generations, the ancestors in the tree begin to repeat themselves. The same names surface again and again, and 53 different people compress into a handful. That compression is what concentrates the founder's genes to a density that does not happen in the open world. And the man Susanna married left the only eyewitness record of the first Thanksgiving. Edward Winslow was the colony's diplomat. He built an alliance with Chief Massasoit, cared for him with his own hands when he was gravely ill, and that alliance bought Plymouth years of peace. He also left the only eyewitness account of the first harvest celebration we call Thanksgiving. His marriages are a clear example of endogamy. In a closed community, almost every union happens within the same circle of founders' descendants, and the share of founder genes grows with each internal marriage instead of being diluted by outside blood. And the next man came over completely alone and waited 3 years for his family. Richard Warren stepped off the Mayflower alone. His wife and 5 daughters did not reach him until 3 years later on the ship Anne. The Warren line became one of the broadest. President Franklin Roosevelt descends from it through the Delano family. Here, the arithmetic needs a correction. There were several ships, but they added very few new founders. The colony grew through the children of the people already there. Geneticists measure this as the effective number of founders, and it stays tiny even as the population grows. In practical terms, just a few dozen people seeded the entire future pool. Roosevelt descends from Warren twice. The second line runs through a man who was trusted with everything and betrayed everyone. But first, the man who kept the soul of the colony alive. William Brewster was the congregation's elder, educated at Cambridge, and once employed by a secretary through whose hands the death warrant of Mary Stuart passed. He had seen power up close, and left it for a handful of the persecuted, and by the time he boarded the Mayflower, he was already older, guiding the colony's spiritual life until his death. The religious isolation of this community is another accelerator of the founder effect. When a group only marries within itself for reasons of faith, founder genes circulate in a closed loop instead of being diluted. The most famous isolates science knows by heart, the Amish and Hutterites, are built exactly this way. Brewster kept the colony's soul alive. The next man kept its body alive, through the winter that was killing everyone. Samuel Fuller was the colony's doctor with no formal training. He simply knew more than the others. During that first winter, he visited as many dying people as he could. He survived it, and in 1633 he died of smallpox, the very disease he had spent his life treating. Each such epidemic is another bottleneck. Disease cuts through the population almost blindly, and the gene pool narrows again and again. Among Fuller's descendants, genealogy names actor Richard Gere. Survival was closer to a lottery. The next family drew its number from across the ocean. Francis Cook was a wool comber from the Leiden congregation. He himself sailed on the Mayflower, and his wife and children were brought over 3 years later by the ship Anne. That is the whole mechanism of settlement. Each new ship only thickened the blood already there, shuffling the same surnames through the colony. Among Cook's descendants is Anna Mary Robertson, Grandma Moses, who began painting at 78. Over all of this business, the money and the debts, was a man who profited from the colony. Isaac Allerton was the governor's assistant and the colony's trade agent in England. And time after time he abused that trust, lining his own pockets at the community's expense until Bradford removed him in disgust. But history remembers him through his daughter. Mary Allerton survived the first winter as a 3-year-old and lived until 1699, the last living Mayflower passenger. From her to us, there are 12 or 13 generations, and at each one, the number of descendants doubles again. That is how the number 35 million is built mathematically, compound growth running for 4 centuries. Roosevelt descends from Allerton through Mary for a second time, and the first parents to die were the ones whose daughter carried the rarest inheritance of all. John and Joan Tilley died in the first winter. Their daughter Elizabeth was orphaned at 13, and grew up to marry John Howland, the same man who had hung onto a line in the middle of the ocean. 2 survivors, 10 children, one of the broadest lines in America. Among her descendants is named philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. And now the thread I asked you to remember. Mitochondrial DNA, a tiny separate genome inside every cell, passes only from mother to child, to sons and daughters, but only daughters carry it forward. So a strictly maternal line carries Elizabeth Tilley's nearly unchanged mitochondrial DNA through the centuries. If such an unbroken female chain has reached the present day, then the same code from the 13-year-old orphan of Plymouth is alive in it now. That is the most literal meaning of the phrase, "They are in your blood." 15 names. A governor who lost his wife before he ever set foot on land. A cooper who became the most common ancestor in the country. A man who hung by a rope in a frozen ocean. A shoemaker with 126 pairs of shoes. A soldier and the man who survived a wreck Shakespeare wrote about. The first man executed for murder. The first child of the New World. The diplomat of the first Thanksgiving. The one who waited 3 years for his family. The elder who saw a queen executed. The doctor who died of his own disease. The wool comber whose descendant began painting at 78. The agent whose daughter outlived them all. And the orphan who married the man from the rope. And that is why these few left a trace, while thousands of colonists who sailed after them vanished without a mark. These 15 stood at the very beginning. Their lines had the most generations in which to multiply. They married inside the tightest circle, where founder genes concentrated, and they left behind documentary trails that let descendants still find themselves. Those who came later, into an already growing country, dissolved into the wider flow. Their share blurred with each generation, while the share of the earliest founder lines only grew. But to be honest, That 35 million figure comes from documents and family trees. There is no sequencing behind it. And that matters when it comes to the promise on the cover. A normal DNA test will not show you the words Mayflower. It will show ancestry percentages and matches to other people who tested. To prove a specific line, there are only two ways: a paper trail all the way back to the ship, or a strict maternal chain for mitochondrial DNA, and a male chain for the Y chromosome. The founder effect explains why so many of these people are in us today. But Mayflower blood runs in me, and I can prove it are two very different statements, and now you know where the line between them is. If one of these 15 names is in your family tree, write it in the comments and say how far back you were able to trace it. Here we go deep into the blood that built America, with real research behind every word.